Peekskill, New York, the 4th of September, 1949, 1:47 in the afternoon. The convoy rolled into Peekskill, resembling a military invasion. 23 vehicles moved in tight formation, advancing deliberately along the main thoroughfare toward Cortlandt Manor, the location where Paul Robeson was set to deliver an open-air performance at 3 o'clock that afternoon. Each automobile transported 4 to 5 individuals, black men who had traveled from Harlem, attired in dark business suits, operating with the precision of trained soldiers, their windows lowered to ensure their faces remained visible so that every observer would comprehend precisely who these men were and the purpose behind their arrival. At the front of the convoy sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 44 years of age, Harlem's most formidable and most esteemed black underworld figure. This was the individual who had constructed his reputation across 4 decades through calculated strategic thinking combined with controlled violence. This was the man who had secured the respect of Italian crime syndicates and instilled fear in anyone who posed a threat to Harlem's residents. The white supremacist crowd assembled along both sides of the street, observed the convoy's approach, and immediately grasped that circumstances had transformed. The power dynamic they had exploited throughout the morning, hurling stones at black concert attendees as they arrived, shouting racist epithets, assaulting individuals with complete impunity, while law enforcement observed without taking action, was on the verge of a violent reversal. Stones started flying toward the vehicles at the front. Glass bottles shattered against windshields. White men brandishing baseball bats and tire irons charged toward the convoy, bellowing threats, emboldened by their superior numbers and capacity for violence. Then the convoy came to a halt. Vehicle doors swung open in unison. 100 men stepped out. They weren't panicked. They weren't fleeing. They weren't acting defensively. They emerged with composure and clear purpose, dispersing along both sides of the street in structured formation, establishing a human passageway that extended from their stopping point all the way to the concert venue half a mile distant. Bumpy Johnson positioned himself in front of his vehicle, absolutely motionless, regarding the white supremacist mob with a demeanor that expressed neither fear nor rage, merely absolute conviction that what was about to unfold would proceed exactly according to his design. The stone-throwing ceased. The shouting diminished. The white men holding weapons faltered, abruptly recognizing they were no longer confronting terrified concert-goers. They were facing a disciplined force that had arrived prepared for precisely this encounter, that anticipated this encounter, that would embrace the chance to return the violence these racists had been threatening since morning. Even the police officers, dozens of them stationed along the route, who had remained passive while white supremacists brutalized black individuals for hours, could sense the authority that had just materialized. They could perceive in the body language of Johnson's forces that these weren't individuals who could be frightened or dispersed. They could comprehend from the military exactness of how the convoy had arrived and positioned itself that this represented an orchestrated mission directed by someone who had calculated every element. The white supremacist crowd retreated gradually, understanding that the uncomplicated violence they had been relishing was finished, that persisting in throwing stones or swinging bats at this convoy would provoke a reaction they weren't equipped to manage. Bumpy Johnson looked straight at the closest cluster of police officers, 5 white cops standing beside their patrol vehicles, who had witnessed white supremacists attacking black people throughout the morning without intervening, and stated in a voice sufficiently loud for everyone in proximity to hear, "We're here to escort Mr. Paul Robeson to his concert. We're here to safeguard the individuals who traveled to watch him perform. And we're here to establish very clearly that anyone who attempts to obstruct us, who attempts to assault Mr. Robeson or the individuals who came to witness him, is going to encounter consequences that they're not going to find pleasant. Now, you police officers have a decision to make. You can fulfill your responsibilities and protect everyone here without discrimination, or you can step aside and observe what transpires when you fail to do so. Regardless of your choice, we're proceeding to that concert venue right now, and Mr. Robeson is going to perform, and no one is going to prevent us. So what's your decision going to be?" The police officers exchanged glances with one another, examined Johnson's 100 men arranged in formation, surveyed the white supremacist mob that had suddenly fallen silent, and calculated that attempting to stop this convoy would generate a degree of violence they weren't prepared to confront. "Just maintain the peace," one officer stated weakly. "No violence from your side." Johnson smiled with cold intensity. "We'll maintain the peace provided. Peace is maintained. But if anyone hurls one additional stone, swings one additional bat, shouts one additional threat at individuals who traveled here to appreciate a concert, we're going to react in ways that clarify very explicitly why Harlem doesn't tolerate racism or violence against our community. Now move aside." The convoy resumed its advance. Johnson's 100 men proceeded in formation on both sides, establishing a protected passageway through which vehicles transporting Paul Robeson and additional concert-goers could travel securely. The white supremacist mob stood observing, powerless and humiliated, comprehending that Harlem had just delivered them a lesson regarding power, that organized discipline defeats unorganized hatred, that 100 prepared men could neutralize a mob numbering in the thousands, and that Bumpy Johnson had just illustrated why his reputation was legendary. The account of how Bumpy Johnson came to command 100 men into Peekskill, New York on September 4th, 1949 commenced 2 days prior with a telephone call that Johnson would subsequently characterize as among the most significant calls he had ever answered. The call arrived on Thursday, September 1st, 1949 at roughly 7:30 in the evening. Johnson was at his residence on Edgecombe Avenue in Harlem, consuming dinner with his wife when the telephone sounded. Theodore Green, the legal counsel who maintained relationships with both Harlem operators and civil rights organizations, was calling, and his voice conveyed an urgency that Johnson instantly recognized as grave. "Bumpy, I require your assistance with something that's more substantial than business operations, more substantial than criminal enterprises. This concerns our community, concerns protecting one of our most vital voices from being silenced through racist violence. Can you meet with me tonight?" Johnson consented immediately. Within 30 minutes, he was seated in Green's office on 125th Street, learning about a situation that would demand everything Johnson had acquired through years of organizing men and strategically deploying force. Green provided the explanation. Paul Robeson, one of the most celebrated Black Americans globally, a vocalist and performer who had attained international recognition, an activist who articulated forceful opposition to racism and colonialism, was scheduled to deliver an outdoor concert in Peekskill, New York on September 4th. The concert represented a fundraising benefit for the Civil Rights Congress, an organization that campaigned against racial discrimination and political suppression. But white supremacist factions had mobilized to prevent the concert from occurring. Local residents had assembled mobs threatening violence against anyone who attended. The Ku Klux Klan and additional racist organizations were planning to physically assault Robeson and concert-goers. Police had clarified they wouldn't furnish adequate protection. In reality, numerous local police sympathized with the white supremacists and would probably permit violence to take place. The initial concert was scheduled for August 27th, Green continued. A white supremacist mob attacked individuals arriving for that concert, hurled rocks, assaulted people with clubs, burned a cross, screamed racial slurs. The concert had to be canceled because the violence was excessively severe. Robeson never even reached the venue. Now he's rescheduling for September 4th, and civil rights organizations are guaranteeing improved security. But Bumpy, I've examined their security arrangements and they're insufficient. These white supremacists are arriving with thousands of people, with weapons, with the intention to grievously injure or kill Robeson if they can reach him. The civil rights organizations have perhaps 50 or 60 individuals willing to furnish security. That's inadequate against thousands of armed racists who possess police backing. Johnson listened attentively, comprehending immediately why Green had contacted him. You want me to supply security that civil rights organizations cannot provide. You want me to mobilize sufficient men with sufficient readiness to employ violence that white supremacists comprehend, that attacking Robeson or concert-goers will produce serious consequences. Exactly, Green stated. Paul Robeson is one of our most crucial voices. He's articulated opposition to racism when doing so was dangerous. He's utilized his celebrity to advocate for our community. And now racists are attempting to silence him through violence, attempting to clarify that black people who speak too assertively will be attacked. We cannot permit that to occur. Bumpy, we cannot permit racists to silence one of our greatest voices, and you're the sole person I know who can organize the caliber of security that genuinely protects Robeson in a situation this perilous. Johnson sat without speaking for several moments, contemplating the logistics, the hazards, the strategy that would be necessary. Finally, he stated, "I'll undertake it. Not for monetary compensation. This isn't a business operation. I'll do it because Paul Robeson represents something significant, and because permitting racists to silence him through violence would constitute accepting that we cannot protect our own people. I'll transport 100 men to Peekskill on September 4th. I will furnish security for Robeson from the instant he arrives until the instant he departs safely, and I will establish very clearly to those white supremacists that attacking Robeson or anyone attending his concert means confronting consequences they're not equipped to handle. That's my commitment." Bumpy Johnson devoted the subsequent 2 days organizing what would become one of the most remarkable displays of coordinated community protection in Harlem's chronicle. He required 100 men willing to confront potentially lethal violence from white supremacists and antagonistic police. He required men who were disciplined sufficiently to obey commands, courageous enough to stand against overwhelming odds, and dedicated enough to the community that they would risk their lives to protect Paul Robeson and the principle he embodied. Johnson invoked every favor he had accumulated across decades of operations. He contacted men who worked within his criminal organization, enforcers, security personnel, soldiers who had demonstrated themselves dependable in dangerous circumstances. He contacted men who didn't work for him but who respected him and understood that he was requesting them to participate in something significant. He contacted union members, longshoremen, construction workers, black men from Harlem who possessed physical courage and who understood that this concerned protecting their community rather than concerning criminal operations. By the evening of September 3rd, Johnson had secured commitments from 103 men, sufficient to provide redundancy if some couldn't attend, sufficient to create the overwhelming demonstration of force that would be essential to discourage violence from thousands of white supremacists. Johnson organized them into units of 5, with each unit possessing a designated leader accountable for coordination and discipline. He conducted a gathering on the evening of September 3rd at a warehouse in Harlem, addressing all 100 men who had committed to the operation. "Tomorrow, we're traveling to Peekskill to protect Paul Robeson," Johnson informed the assembled men. "We're going because white supremacists attempted to halt his previous concert through violence, and they're planning to repeat it tomorrow. We're going because Paul Robeson is one of our greatest voices, and we cannot allow racists to silence him through intimidation and violence. We're going to establish very clearly that attacking Robeson or individuals who traveled to witness him perform will trigger consequences that those racists aren't prepared to confront." Johnson continued, presenting the strategy. "We're transporting 23 cars in tight formation. We're arriving at 1:45 p.m., 15 minutes before Robeson is scheduled to arrive. We're establishing a protected corridor from the road to the concert grounds, and we're sustaining that corridor throughout the concert so individuals can arrive and depart safely. We're not initiating violence, but if white supremacists assault us, we're responding immediately and decisively. We're demonstrating to them that Harlem protects its own, that we're organized, disciplined, and willing to combat if combat becomes necessary." The men listened with intensity, comprehending the seriousness of what they were undertaking. Some of them would subsequently recall that Johnson's concluding words before they departed, that gathering captured perfectly why they were willing to risk their lives for this operation. Paul Robeson doesn't know most of us personally. He's not affiliated with our criminal operations. He's not compensating us for this protection, but he's one of us. He's a black man who has achieved greatness despite racism, who has utilized his voice to advocate for our community, who represents what we can accomplish when we're granted the opportunities we deserve. Tomorrow, white supremacists are attempting to silence him, attempting to clarify that black people who speak too assertively will be beaten into submission. We're traveling to Peekskill to demonstrate they're mistaken. We're going to reveal that Harlem protects its heroes, that organized black men can stand against racist mobs, and that violence against our people produces consequences. That's the reason we're doing this. Not for money, not for reputation. We're doing it because it's correct. The convoy assembled in Harlem at 11 a.m. on Sunday, September 4th, 1949. 23 cars, 100 men, all attired in dark suits that made them appear like an organized military force rather than a random collection of individuals. Bumpy Johnson inspected the convoy before departure, advancing from car to car, verifying that every unit comprehended its assignment, ensuring that discipline and coordination would be preserved throughout the operation. At 11:30 a.m., the convoy departed Harlem, traveling north toward Peekskill. The journey required approximately 2 hours, providing Johnson time to contemplate what they were about to confront. The situation in Peekskill was already deteriorating. Reports arriving from civil rights organizers on the ground indicated that thousands of white supremacists had congregated, that they were intercepting cars transporting black concert-goers and assaulting passengers, that police were doing nothing to halt the violence. The Ku Klux Klan maintained a visible presence. Men were carrying weapons openly: baseball bats, tire irons, brass knuckles, some rumors of firearms. The atmosphere was saturated with hatred and the anticipation of violence. Johnson understood that his 100 men would be outnumbered potentially 10 to 1 or more. But he also understood something that the white supremacist mob failed to understand: that organization defeats numbers, that discipline defeats rage, that 100 prepared men advancing with coordinated purpose could dominate a situation where thousands of disorganized racists were merely expressing hatred without strategic thinking. As the convoy approached Peekskill at 1:30 p.m., Johnson radioed instructions to all units. We're entering hostile territory. Remain calm. Remain disciplined. Don't respond to verbal provocations. But if anyone hurls a rock, swings a weapon, physically assaults any of our people, respond immediately with overwhelming force. We're here to protect Robeson and concert-goers, and we're going to accomplish that mission regardless of what's required. At 1:47 p.m., the convoy entered Peekskill's main road and encountered precisely what Johnson had anticipated: chaos, violence, and a white supremacist mob that had been assaulting black concert-goers for hours while police stood by and observed. When Bumpy Johnson's convoy halted and 100 men emerged in organized formation, the entire dynamic of the situation transformed instantly. The white supremacist mob had been operating with impunity throughout the morning, attacking individuals who were isolated and frightened, overwhelming them through numbers and violence while police refused to intervene. But Johnson's 100 men weren't isolated or frightened. They were organized, coordinated, and evidently prepared for violence if violence became necessary. The formation Johnson's men established was strategically magnificent. They formed 2 parallel lines along both sides of the road, establishing a protected corridor roughly 10 feet wide that extended half a mile from where they had stopped to the concert grounds. Anyone proceeding through that corridor was protected by 50 men on each side, men who were monitoring for threats and prepared to respond instantaneously. White supremacists who had been hurling rocks and attacking isolated concert-goers suddenly found themselves confronting an organized force that was observing them specifically, that was prepared to retaliate immediately if they attacked anyone inside the protected corridor. The uncomplicated violence they had been enjoying was finished. Some white supremacists attempted to sustain their aggression. A group of roughly 15 men approached the corridor with baseball bats, screaming racial slurs, threatening to attack. Johnson's men didn't retreat or display fear. They simply adjusted positions slightly, compressing their formation, clarifying they were ready for confrontation. Johnson himself walked to the front of the formation and addressed the white supremacists directly. "You can walk away at this moment, or you can assault us and discover what happens when you attack organized black men who arrived prepared for exactly this situation. Your choice? But choose quickly, because we're not standing here debating all day." The white supremacists looked at Johnson, looked at his 100 men standing in disciplined formation, looked at each other, and calculated that attacking this force would result in violence they weren't prepared to manage. They retreated gradually, maintaining their verbal aggression, but abandoning their physical threat. This confrontation was repeated multiple times during the subsequent 30 minutes as different groups of white supremacists tested Johnson's formation, searching for weakness, attempting to determine if they could penetrate and attack concertgoers inside the corridor. Every time, Johnson's men maintained discipline, displayed no fear, clarified they were prepared for violence without initiating it, and waited for the white supremacists to calculate that attacking was more dangerous than retreating. Every time, the white supremacists retreated. At 2:15 p.m., Paul Robeson arrived at the concert grounds, driven through Johnson's protected corridor in a car surrounded by additional security, furnished by civil rights organizations and union members who had volunteered to assist. Robeson stepped from his car and observed Johnson's 100 men maintaining formation along the road, observed the white supremacist mob that had been neutralized by their organized presence, understood immediately that Harlem had dispatched an army to protect him. Robeson walked over to where Johnson stood, coordinating the security operation they had never met before. Johnson operated in criminal circles, while Robeson operated in entertainment and activism, but both men understood who the other was and what this moment represented. "Mr. Johnson," Robeson stated, extending his hand, "Theodore Green informed me you were organizing security. I didn't fully comprehend what that meant until I witnessed your men creating that corridor through a mob of thousands. Thank you. Thank you for protecting me and everyone who traveled here today despite the violence and hatred." Johnson shook Robeson's hand firmly. "Mr. Robeson, you've been advocating for our community for years, utilizing your voice when utilizing it was dangerous. Today it's our turn to advocate for you. Go perform your concert. We'll maintain this corridor throughout, and we'll escort you safely from here when you're finished. Nobody's going to touch you or anyone here today. That's my commitment." The concert commenced at 3 o'clock. Roughly 20,000 people attended, far more than had been anticipated, partly because news of the violence at the canceled August 27th concert had generated publicity and determination among civil rights supporters to attend the rescheduled concert as an act of defiance against racism. Johnson's men maintained their formation throughout the 3-hour concert, standing in the hot September sun, monitoring the white supremacist mob that remained nearby but that no longer dared to attack individuals moving through the protected corridor. At one point during the concert, a group of roughly 30 white supremacists attempted to breach the corridor from the side, rushing toward concert-goers with weapons. Johnson's men responded instantaneously. The nearest unit of 5 men intercepted the attackers, engaging in hand-to-hand combat that lasted roughly 2 minutes before the white supremacists retreated, several of them injured. Understanding that Johnson's men weren't merely providing symbolic protection, they were willing and able to fight. Police officers who had been standing idle throughout the day finally intervened after this confrontation, not to arrest the white supremacists who had attacked, but to create greater separation between the mob and Johnson's corridor, understanding that additional violence would be attributed to their failure to maintain order. The concert concluded at 6 p.m. Paul Robeson performed for 3 hours, singing spirituals and folk songs, speaking about civil rights and human dignity, demonstrating precisely why white supremacists wanted to silence him, because his voice was powerful, inspiring, dangerous to individuals who wanted to preserve racial hierarchy. As concert-goers began departing, Johnson's men maintained their corridor, permitting people to reach their cars safely, while white supremacists observed from a distance, impotent and frustrated that they had been unable to deliver the violence they had promised. At 6:30 p.m., Robeson was escorted back through the corridor to his car. Johnson accompanied him personally, walking beside the vehicle as it advanced slowly through the protected corridor toward the main road where Robeson would depart Peekskill. Before Robeson's car pulled away, he lowered the window and stated to Johnson, "What you accomplished today, organizing this security, mobilizing these men, standing against that mob, this is as significant as anything I could accomplish through singing or speaking. You've demonstrated that our community protects its own, that organized black men can stand against racist violence, that we don't have to accept intimidation and hatred. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. History will remember what you accomplished here today." Johnson responded simply, "History can remember or forget. That's not our reason for coming. We came because it was correct, because you deserved protection that you weren't receiving from authorities who should have furnished it. Now, travel safely, Mr. Robeson. Continue utilizing your voice. We'll continue protecting our community." Robeson's car departed without incident. Johnson's convoy maintained position for another hour, ensuring that all concert-goers who wanted to depart could do so safely through the protected corridor. At 7:45 p.m., with the concert grounds empty and all attendees departed, Johnson issued the order for his men to pack up and return to Harlem. They had been standing in formation for 6 hours, had engaged in several confrontations with white supremacists, had maintained discipline and coordination throughout despite heat, fatigue, and constant tension. The convoy returned to Harlem at roughly 10 p.m. As they traveled through Harlem's streets, residents who had heard about what transpired in Peekskill emerged to cheer, to applaud, to celebrate that their community had successfully protected Paul Robeson and had demonstrated that organized black men could stand against racist mobs. The Peekskill riots, as the events of August 27th and September 4th, 1949 became known, were extensively covered by newspapers nationally and internationally. The violence, the racism, the police complicity, all of it was documented and publicized. But within Harlem specifically, what people remembered most wasn't the white supremacist violence. What they remembered was Bumpy Johnson mobilizing 100 men to Peekskill, establishing a protected corridor through a hostile mob, standing against thousands of racists who had been terrorizing black concert-goers, and successfully protecting Paul Robeson and ensuring his concert occurred, despite everything white supremacists had attempted to prevent it. The operation became legendary in Harlem as an example of community protection at its finest. When legal authorities failed to protect black citizens, when police stood by while racists attacked, Harlem organized its own protection and delivered it effectively through discipline, coordination, and willingness to fight when fighting became necessary. Paul Robeson himself discussed the Peekskill experience many times in subsequent years, always crediting the union members and community volunteers who furnished security, understanding that publicly identifying Bumpy Johnson's role might create legal difficulties, but privately expressing gratitude for Johnson's protection. Theodore Green, the attorney who had connected Johnson with the security request, later stated, "What Bumpy accomplished in Peekskill demonstrated something that people often forget about him. Yes, he was a criminal who operated illegal enterprises, but he was also a community protector who understood that certain principles transcended business considerations. Paul Robeson required protection that legal authorities refused to provide, and Bumpy provided it because it was correct, because Robeson represented values and achievements that deserved protection. That operation, mobilizing 100 men, maintaining discipline for 6 hours under extreme pressure, successfully protecting Robeson and thousands of concert-goers, that was Bumpy at his finest. The day Bumpy Johnson mobilized 100 men to Peekskill to protect Paul Robeson became one of the most celebrated events in Johnson's legendary career. Not because it was violent, though it could have been, not because it generated profit. It didn't. But because it demonstrated perfectly what community protection meant when that community was Black Americans facing racist violence in 1949 America. Legal authorities couldn't be trusted to protect Black citizens equally. Police in Peekskill and many other locations sympathized with white supremacists and permitted violence against Black people to occur without intervention. The legal system that was supposed to protect everyone actually protected only white people while permitting Black people to be terrorized. In that context, Bumpy Johnson's decision to organize 100 men and personally lead them into a hostile situation where they were outnumbered by thousands represented something profound. The principle that communities protect their own when legal protection fails, that organized discipline defeats unorganized hatred, that standing against racism sometimes requires willingness to fight rather than merely willingness to speak. Johnson never sought publicity for the Peekskill operation. He never attempted to profit from it or utilize it to enhance his criminal reputation. He did it because it was correct, because Paul Robeson deserved protection, because permitting racists to silence one of Black America's greatest voices through violence would have been accepting powerlessness. That's the legacy of September 4th, 1949. Not merely that Bumpy Johnson protected Paul Robeson, but that he demonstrated what organized Black community power could accomplish when it was applied strategically and courageously in defense of principles that transcended individual self-interest. Somewhere in that protected corridor, somewhere in the formation of 100 men who stood for 6 hours against thousands of white supremacists, somewhere in Johnson's calm certainty that his mission would succeed, somewhere in all of that was the essence of what made Bumpy Johnson legendary. Not merely the criminal who operated Harlem's illegal enterprises, but the community protector who understood that certain values, dignity, respect, protection of the vulnerable, mattered more than profit or safety or any other consideration. That was September 4th, 1949. That was the day Bumpy Johnson mobilized 100 men to war and prevailed without firing a shot. That was the day Harlem rescued Paul Robeson and proved that organized community power could stand against hatred and prevail.